Ding. We are live, or we've been live. I don't know, that whole countdown part always messes me up. So I'm going to start back up from my goal of doing a post every day for one. Oops. um, I see now how much work and effort goes into coming up with stuff that you can rant about for at least an hour straight. But I'm gonna do the whole subject about this one is about bootlegging. I've been trying to have this conversation on Instagram Live, and it just keeps cutting out. But Instagram is where I have the most sort of dialogue or back and forth with people, toy nerds and stuff. And so, in talking about bootlegging and stuff, we kind of came up with a lot of really interesting stuff. It started around with me talking about bootlegging this figure, um, just like a, and then there's a body. The leg broke off, but the skull would go on the body, and then the helmet would fit over over the head and the body, and then there's arms. One arm is a gun, one arm is a sword or like a lightsaber or some shit. It would make more sense once it's all together. So the idea is, many, many, many years ago, there was a very popular toy maker who is still popular now. Nag, 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 and that first figure. It was around the time when I forget. I think the figure has a name, Boryoku Genjin or something. And so it was around the time where the figure went from being the kind of in demand to being just this like super crazy inflated price. And I think it was like retail. I don't think it had gone through the $1,000 mark yet, but it was like around the 800 mark. People were just going crazy. And at the time I was really, I was annoyed because, it was like the whole community was like losing their shit, like just sort of going nuts over this thing. When all of this stuff comes from the same factory. And so, I had one of the first releases, or one of the earlier releases, and so I made a silicone mold, and then I copied it, and then I just melted it and dipped it in wax and melted it and fucked with it and added and subtracted and did all this weird shit. But sort of at its core, and when everything's assembled, you can see at its base it's made up of that thing. And so that's where this dialogue about bootlegging on Instagram was really coming about. That idea of, where's the line? At what point do you put your thumbprint on something enough that it's now changed or it's altered? A really interesting point that was brought up in the Instagram was the idea of bootlegging as a parody, and doing this stuff as like, hey, here's the popular stuff. And so here I'm going to bootleg it in a way that is kind of mocking it, shedding light on it, but also as a series and really stretching it out as a sort of parody series. It might make a little bit more sense. So like as an example, I just kind of had one of these Nino figures from Izumo Blood Guts Toys, and so I made this like head. From that, I made like this wax head that I can then just make a mold of. But I also, that's to sort of show you, but I also wanted to show you guys, just do a quick little tutorial of like how I do it. So I've made, this is just oil clay, the same stuff you would use for making silicone molds. I think some people sculpt with this. This is the cheap oil clay stuff. And I, thinned it out, and then I just wrapped it around. I wrapped it around this lower part of the body, and then I have an upper part of the body. So it's just going to be one piece that'll pull just down from here. And from those two pieces, then I will heat them up and seal them together, and then go back in and just sort of remelt and recarve and just kind of refuck with the texture. But so I have my pre-made hollowed out oil clay mold. I've got my wax. I should have a box around here somewhere. I thought I put everything within reach. Balls. If you see light coming through, like I can see when I hold it up to the light, I can see some little light shining through. So just kind of go in and push that in. And then I'll pour in a small amount and just kind of roll it around a little bit just to check, like, there's no holes or anything. And then I'll fill it up, slowly, and just kind of look if anything's leaking out. Get it to, kind of a good level. You want to work quick because, wax is, it's weird. It is very temperamental in some ways, and it's very forgiving in other ways. So it just kind of takes a little bit of futzing around with. The other part, this other piece, it's actually, since I'm connecting this bottom piece to the other part, and I want this top of the head to have a kind of a deep recess to really like draw in, since it's going to be one piece, I want it to be kind of funky. So I'm actually doing this open, hello, I made an open mold, and this is going to be that upper top part. So this back line in here, that's the back of the fin, or no, the face is here, the back of the fin is here, so it's split going this way and this way. So you can't see because of this angle, but what I have down here is a 1/4-inch piece of steel, cold steel, because I know it's going to be flat. I know, it'll always, when I pour the wax on, the wax is going to cool on that flat surface, and it's not going to leak out from under the bottom where the weight from the wax um, is, it's pushing. It's all these different forces are sort of want to kind of like push it apart. So you always want to be really careful rolling out the oil clay into a thin sheet. I can see already the lighting is horrible, so my apologies. But it has an imprint. There's some texture from the figure, and so what I would do is then make just a hollow vessel without giving any thought to like what the form is or anything. Just kind of make a bowl, or make a tube, or make a. You want something that will hold the wax, a form for which the wax can hold itself to. Sometimes I might have a shape in mind that I'm aiming for, or like a general shape where I want to make a big round thing, or I want to make a flat pancakey thing. This kind of lets you kind of futz around with form a bit in just a different way. So, I took that sheet, and then there's let's see if any of the texture is coming up. You can see a little bit of the texture in there. Yeah, you can see there's some texture in there. And I know just generally from the sort of volume and shape, this is going to be kind of a pancakey head. If I put a bend in the top, then I know it'll kind of have some point up horn ear thingy bobbers. Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna just I'll just do this real basic, simple shape, just so you can get an idea of it. Went from a flat piece, there was texture, and then rolled it over. Take your wax and then just fill it up. I've been getting a ton of people asking me about the specific recipe for wax. I'm not sure if it's something I want to start sharing just yet, uh, because everybody has their own sort of like proprietary mix, and I don't want to upset anybody who's doing this as a full-time gig. But I will say, if you are working with wax, I mean, with this stuff, in this way, you can work with candle wax. You could work with, I mean, any candles in your house. You could melt down any candle. If you have a saucepan, if you have a kettle, something that can just get dirty, can get covered in wax, and is fine to get messy and just be the wax pot. Get candles. You can get from like hobby supply stores. There's a whole candle making scene. You can experiment with different compositions. There's a ton of different types of wax out there: beeswax, carnauba, paraffin, palbox, micro. I don't know. You could go on and have a strong elasticity and be able to bend and stretch and stick, and some just crack and snap. Um, I like to actually make several different kinds of wax depending on what the project is. Depending on if I know that I need to manipulate the wax a bit, if I know that the original sculpt at its core, the volume is just a tad bit too narrow, what I'll do is I'll use a more elastic wax, and I will go in and just sort of digitally manipulate it to kind of thicken up, to widen up a little bit. I know it's a little bit hard to kind of conceptualize, but think about it as like, somebody sends me a balloon, and the balloon just doesn't quite fit through, um, or doesn't quite fit into this space that it needs to fit into. So I'll open it up and just kind of like push it out, fill it in a little bit, and let it, sit in like that. Maybe the balloon isn't the best analogy. I'm not sure what would be a better comparable thing to kind of like picture, but when you're dealing with size and volume and form, a lot of times, if at your core, your original sculpt, the form is off, it's really hard to kind of keep whatever look and aesthetic and design you have and go bigger in volume. Oftentimes, the only way to go bigger is just to add stuff on, bulk things out, build and build and build. Which is great to do in your sculpting stage. When I sculpt, I like to kind of do that build out and then add and add. But then once you're in wax, knowing that you have a little bit of wiggle room to kind of massage things around a bit, is a bit helpful, I find. Um, so in doing this kind of stuff, this is what really helped me figure out all of my different wax compositions, all the different kinds of wax that I liked for what they did and what they didn't do. And then just kind of like experimented with, different compositions and amounts. So here is the weird shape I took from the flat form. There was texture put in it. Poured in the wax. The wax, if the oil clay, if it's a cold day, if the oil clay, if you haven't been, fucking around with it too much, it should be relatively cold. I have done things before where I've taken the oil clay and then put it in the fridge or put it in the freezer and then poured the wax into the frozen oil clay form. And it creates generally it creates a kind of a cool wavy pattern. I've made a few figures from just doing it like that, just that wavy pattern. When you're opening it up, you want to be careful. It is probably still pretty warm. depending on your shape, depending on how complex of a figure or form you've made. Um, you know, some will be floppier, some will be less floppy. So here you can see is the shape that came out of that form. So this clay or this wax is still quite warm, but it is setting up a bit. I can feel when I put my thumb inside where the wax was cooling down, and then I just poured out. I emptied out to give myself a hollow wax. I can definitely feel inside is quite toasty in there. But oh shit. I was trying to go smooth and I just had way too much power. Oops, that's a blowout. Um, Fortunately, this one that I have is pretty sticky, so it actually just kind of sticks back in place. But now that I know structurally there's this kind of big crack going through it. I know that it's just always that crack. I don't know how well you can see, but that crack's always just gonna kind of come back. Um, but let's see if I can't kind of smush stuff around and squish it into something. I don't know, doing it from the inside, but that crack is always going to kind of be in there. So you're going to have to contend with that or futz with that. Sometimes I just kind of chalk it up to like, well, okay, maybe I'll start doing these. I'll just make these like real weird little free-form little candle things. I don't know, futz around with it. But as you can see, how I went from my rolled out piece of oil clay to then make a form to then make a piece. Oftentimes, what I like to do when I make a piece and I see, oh, okay, it's looking like that, then I'll work on like really manipulating the form. Like, oh, I want it to have horns, some horns that come up. So I'm going to push internally. I'm going to push up so that there's more weird thumb horns going on in there. Maybe this will be a more demonic looking dude the next time I pour it. I can also see it's sort of flat. It doesn't quite have the volume of the head that I want. So I can kind of, again, push from the inside out. So a lot of this stuff, a lot of this form, this give and take or back and forth of form is really coming from pushing force on your hollow vessel, pushing in from the outside in to decrease the volume, and then sort of looking inside and guessing what the shape kind of looks like, and then pushing from the inside out. So pushing, and that's going to bulk out and give you more form and volume. There are sort of standard, things like heads. I know that kind of like generally, if it's a round shape, and if this is going to be the front, man, this lighting is just fucking horrible. This is why I don't want to do these YouTube lives until I get a better setup. But generally I'll know that a head, like if this is the back of the head and this is the front of the head, I want to put a little bit more of that profile kind of muzzle in here. I know that if this is going to be the front, maybe there's going to be some eyes kind of set down in here. And generally you've got more of a recess in your eyes, so I'll kind of just push on. Man, you can't see shit. damn it. Well, anyway, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I want to actually make these like condensed tutorials about. So this type of stuff where I just start from a flat sheet of oil clay and then pour in wax. Um, I call that mu. In Japanese, mu means nothingness. So it's, I've done figures like I did grouse, which is a bird. Um, I just made this shape and I just looked at it and I was like, oh, I guess the texture, whatever, you look like a bird. So I just made that thing and then called it a bird. And some people think it's weird and interesting. Most people are like, what the shit is that? But I've done a lot of other forms, things like um, much more complex shapes, like this body shape, this entire body and legs and feet were all just sculpted in pushing in texture and then making a shape and then pouring the wax in. I did the feet, the legs, and the body in 3 different parts of oil clay, and then just with a wood burnishing tool connected one wax piece to another wax piece. So for working with wax, connecting wax, you're always working in heat. You don't have to get they sell really expensive wax tools, wax pens for people who sculpt and work in wax. If it's something that you really like doing, you like working in that, yeah, I would say invest in the $100, $200, $300 price range, depending on what sort of bells and whistles and doodads best accommodate you. But if you just if you want to get in base level stuff, you're already using melted candles for wax. You haven't invested in like all the crazy wax stuff. You used an old pot. You're using clay. You can just get in where you fit in. Wood burnishing tools work. Some of them are a bit too hot. I find most soldering irons, the lowest temperature soldering iron is too hot. It just that super super high heat just fucking incinerates the wax. If you wanted to use a soldering iron, you would need to get a voltage regulator that's regulating how much power is going into that soldering iron. There's all kinds of YouTube videos on how to set up your own cheap voltage regulator. You can do that. I find I got like a $50 woodworking tool that works fine. It melts. I can control the temperature. I can get it, really, really hot if I need to melt away a lot of wax. I can turn it down super low if I just barely want to like melt stuff. You know, kind of futz around with it. Um, Again, kind of just playing around with it and seeing what fits in. I already realized that I fucked this up. Oops. But that's fine. As a, I mean, generally, I do these when I do these types of molds. I don't let them sit that long. I usually do them very thin, almost paper thin. And I find that doing them paper thin, it's easier to regulate the temperature. It's easier to kind of stretch stuff and not crack stuff. The thicker it is, the easier it is to crack. So whenever I do this stuff, I try to do it. I'll only keep the wax in the cavity for 30 seconds, a pretty short amount of time. That one I have to let cool down all the way down. So yeah, these will cool down. These will actually take a good part of the day to cool down to where I can kind of start futzing with them more. But this is how this style came about is, as I'm doing other projects, usually I have wax that's cooling down or I have something that needs to set or something needs to cure. And so when I have this downtime, instead of just like zoning out on the phone, I'll just kind of fiddle around with whatever is around me. And I came up with this technique, just randomly and just kind of putzing around. But it is I think it's kind of like a fun little experiment, or again, it's kind of like doodling when you're on the phone, or as you're trying to think through ideas, or just maybe even just kind of calm your mind, calm your stresses down, or you were so focused on all the other stuff you're doing, you want to just kind of like unwind a little bit. I find this is it's almost, it's fun, or it's kind of therapeutic. You're pushing in textures, you're playing around with different patterns, textures, shapes, size, volume, and you just kind of looking around at like seeing if any of the little monsters are staring back at you, which is always kind of a fun little experiment. So I think that's why I'm going to do stuff like these techniques. I mean, I'm going to show everybody all of these different techniques in ways in which you can get a bootleg across. So this will actually be kind of like an ongoing series, and I think starting from this project, and then moving on maybe to Izumo. I actually haven't sent a picture of it yet. I got to send one. Sorry, Maury, but I took one of Reelhead's little sleeping cat or laying cat, and then I just made a quick mold of that, so you can see they're the same, generally the same profile. Man, that lighting is horrible. Can you see that there's a tail? I kept the tail on that side, and then I just carved in this really deformed, weird shaped skull, just a misshaped skull that just kind of is smashed into what this volume is. Again, I guess the idea being, or trying to be, that where is that line in bootlegging? At what point are you then switching something over? Now, one of the good things that was brought up about bootlegging was the parody, and so starting from that, doing stuff like this, I think we'll call it Parody Pals or something like that, and just do like a whole ongoing series. And I think if I do it in a way that is fun and funny and lighthearted enough and goofy enough that doesn't, it doesn't distract. If anything, it helps and brings more attention to what the original brand is. I think if in doing that, if you're so blatantly, I'm parodying this guy, it's only going to send people to that guy to be like, well, who is he? Let me check him out. Why would you bother, bootlegging that guy? So I wanted to read a great DM that I got, and just kind of touch upon all of this stuff as it's talking about bootlegging. It says, on the bootlegging conversation, I think that you have an advanced understanding of postmodernism / contemporary art. Thank you. And it goes on to say, I often question the cultural relevance of the subject. I want to see the artist's commitment to the subject matter. Personally, I don't mind if it's an artist's earnest homage to a cultural icon. I want the object to scream commitment to the subject matter. And I think that's a really great point. I think that's a really valid point, which is not only, going to the dance, going to the dance, going to the date, you go into the dance with your date. Fuck, I don't even remember what it is, but, not only having the idea, but then sort of like bringing that idea across, expressing that idea, having that idea come from an idea, and then speaking more upon that idea, using it both visually in the way you talk about it, in the packaging, in the whole way you kind of bring it across if you sell it. And I do often kind of bring up this adage of, you know, s- selling apples and advertising apples, bringing, having the thing that you said that it was, and just that kind of like being honest, um, which I think would be kind of like a good, another way of saying, commitment to a subject, which is, um, you know, honestly bringing that across. Um, Then they go on to, as for the classics, Godzilla, Zagora, Ape, King Kong. I love those. They're almost mythical icons at this point. That goes into what I would say are tropes. And in bootlegging, that's where bootlegging becomes, I think, the most interesting for most people is when people bootleg tropes and do their kind of take or their version on those tropes. And we've seen in the toy community things like King Kong, apes, primates tend to just do really well. Any company that makes one of those figures, generally that figure usually sells all right. I think there's a lot of guys out there that are like, I collect apes. Um, but also bootlegging those shapes, those old shapes. So I would love to do in this stuff in the same way of doing this moose stuff of current makers. I'd love to also bootleg just really cool. There's old, I'd love to do bootlegs of old bootlegs that are just funky and cool. But again, working within those tropes will always you'll always get eyeballs. So the reason why they're tropes, the reason why people bootleg old kaiju figures or old monsters is because it's a model that works. It's a thing that there's already a fan base already looking for that stuff. So if you can make the thing that people are already looking for and you happen to actually make it fit in with what it looks like, sounds like, says like, comes across like, if you hit all those checks and boxes, um, people will generally get into it. They go on to say, it's important for artistic learning to emulate what you see. I wouldn't have ever been able to learn how to draw comics without tracing Spider Man comics, learning anatomy and dynamic form. Again, another really great point, which is, I mean, that's all art. Everybody, you would draw the stuff you see, you would draw the stuff around you. A lot of times when people go into fine art or go into illustration, go into anatomy, they start from a very traditional artist background, which is okay, I'm going to look at this form. But I think this is great. If you want to do comics and you copy Spider-Man, that gives you a really great sense of what fits within this space. What's your hand actually doing? I often find the way I learn things best is kinesthetically and by just getting my hands in there and physically doing it first makes my brain go, oh, well, what about this? Oh, well, okay, I guess I see how that works. Can I do this also? Um, so, of course, you're going to copy the stuff that's around you. You're going to copy the stuff that you look at. Oftentimes, people copy the stuff that they think is cool. A lot of bootlegging comes out of people really being geeked out fans, really admiring the thing, wanting that thing, not being able to get that thing, and just being like, okay, well, I'll make it myself. Um, that's why it was, funny for me to bootleg something out of spite. And that's why I was like, do I want to make this? But as I'm looking at it sort of transferring or changing into a totally different project, we'll see. I'm on the fence. But um, then closing goes into on the American resin bootlegs. I like how it brings vintage Star Wars and Masters of the Universe back into the cultural artistic scope and recontextualizes the toys. Um, yeah, exactly. This stuff, this is our lexicon. This is our verbiage. We're all dudes in our, you know, and by dudes, I mean, men and women that are just, derpy dudes sitting around into toys, Um, this is the stuff that we grew up on. This is the stuff that we saw. This is stuff we were geeked out. And now that we're making stuff, we're like, well, what's cool? Well, what's a toy? Well, I remember it was cool when you had the thing in your hand. And now, what the resin community is doing is really just using that symbology, really using that symbolism and those tropes in that form to tell a wide range, just a vast swath of humanity, all different insider jokes, memes, cultural references. It runs the gamut. It just, I mean, it goes nuts. Um, I said, thanks for reading my rant. Thank you for sending in the rant. Um, and then you go on, I got a pair of bootleg Nike Yeezy 2s, totally worth it. So there you go. I mean, what is bootlegging? What what's good for the goose may not be good for the gander. What's good for the gander may work out really great for geese. So, let that kind of sink into your noodle. There's one more that I wanted to read. Dung. Today's drink is CC Lemon and sparkling water. Okay. This one's a little bit long. And then seeing, yeah, that didn't really work that way. As a fan and as a member in a community of a fan, people go, yeah, that was a problem across the board. And so a lot of times bootlegging really comes out of a necessity from the fans' point of view of going, we've built this universe, we just want the perfect one. We want just the one right one. And then it becomes this like sort of visceral thing. So, you know, then on that level, does Hasbro or Takara care about fourth wave generation shit? Or like, are they just like, whatever, dude, we were on fucking Netflix, you know, fucking, we're over it. It's funny because then it leads into then the next point. I watched that show on Netflix. It was called Slobby Robbie, and he's a dude that resells vintage clothing from the early '90s, like starter jackets, older concert T-shirts, just normal shit we had as a kid. But now he's selling these old T-shirts for like 150 a piece. You should watch it if you haven't, if you have Netflix, because it's really interesting. Um, as he goes in detail a lot about Gucci bootlegs versus replicas. And I didn't even know this was a thing. There are levels to the quality of bootlegs. Yeah, dude, shout out to Slobby Robbie, Tucson, man. Fucking um, 4th Avenue, T-Town, dude. Slobby Robbie. I want to see the show. It's cool to see Generation Cool going that long. I know good old Slobby Robbie has been holding down that Gucci grind for a very long time. So shout out. Um, so what I found to be really interesting is collectors are specifically collecting the replica bootlegs versus the real shit, and sometimes paying a pretty steep premium for it. So yeah, that's a really great point brought up, which is how does bootlegging affect really that brand's community as a whole? And when you're Gucci, people are buying Gucci because they want people to know they're wearing real Gucci. Um, People wearing bootleg Gucci, they know they bought it at a cheap price. Um, they know if somebody really, if they were standing next to a person who was super in love with Gucci, they would be like, "Oh, that's not a real Gucci thing," and be like, a lot of times, what the original brand makes tends to be far more limiting in scope than the second wave, third wave, fourth wave. All these other bootleg variations will take a run on an idea where you're like, oh fuck yeah, that really does marriage. That's the great taste of peanut butter and chocolate all combined in one. Um, And I think it comes down to how that stuff is sold. I mean, people are buying when people are buying a high price on bootleg Gucci, they know they're buying a high price because they want that specific thing. So if anything, I think all it really does is just make a more kind of like rabid collector. You couldn't have a rabid bootleg Gucci collector without a really well established Gucci company. Nobody is going to give a fuck about bootleg, Oshkosh bagoshes because they ain't rocking Oshkosh bagosh, you know? Um, so I guess that kind of speaks a little bit more on this whole thing culturally on, if you have something that people want to bootleg, that means that you've got some cachet in cool, whatever it is. Um, so using bootlegging as this kind of like back and forth dialogue from manufacturer to customer and customer back to manufacturer, I think is a really kind of an interesting, I don't know, just an interesting way of looking at like, what is all this stuff that we're making? What is this stuff that we're buying? What is this stuff we're hoarding? What is all this, crap that's going on our shelves? Um, and looking at bootlegging stuff in a way that's like makes it, compact, easy to digest, easy to see. It's that junk food for your eyeballs, and it's just like, that the Simpsons where they're like, Homer's in hell and they're like, you like donuts? He's like, yes. And they're like, eat all the donuts you can. He's like, dong, dong, dong. And they're like shoving donuts eyes all dong, 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 more, dong, 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 more. Um, so maybe the whole point of bootlegging is to just stuff all them donuts down everybody's throats. But again, that's just brings up really interesting points of, if your bootleg, in this example, this figure, sells very rarely, which I, felt was kind of a shame because it's an interesting shape, it's an interesting figure. It culturally, it definitely has a footnote in history in this sort of scene and this history. Um, there are these anomalies. There's just a shootout. But to me, it's a shame because it's so stifling that it's most people don't have them on their shelf. So it's interesting that everybody's got a fucking opinion about a thing they don't even got one of. So if I made the bootleg cheap version, I mean, obviously, clearly, it's not the same thing. It obviously doesn't look exactly like the thing, but that's, I guess, sort of that's the line of where a bootleg is. In that first DM where they talked about that, I didn't really go into detail about MVH and him getting bootleg. Um, when a small indie guy is getting bootlegged by just another small indie guy, it's just bizarre. It's just a weird, bizarre way of just, I don't know, man. I mean, the guy that's bootlegging MVH, like, I wonder if he cries when he jerks off. Like, I wonder if that's just like how he jerks off, or I wonder if he like jerks off on this stuff, or if any of this stuff like he made it just so he can like fit it like in his asshole. I don't know, man. Humans are weird. People do weird, weird shit. We've seen it time and time again in through through the millennia. People do all kinds of like bizarre shit. Um, so I don't. I mean, I don't know. I don't fault bootleggers. I mean, I had talked about this before in an older post where if there was somebody, I mean, people have taken my ideas, people have taken concepts that I started, and they've made more money from concepts that I started doing. I don't feel all that significant that my concepts were groundbreaking or anything. It's just there was holes in the market that I filled in, and obviously proof of concept proved that they worked because other people were able to make more money. I just didn't, I guess that's the honesty of driving a thing through. I didn't really drive that stuff through. So, um, bootlegging, like taking that whatever that core, that form, that idea, that shape, and then repackaging that and carrying that across. Um, I find it's the intent of the project is more on that back end. When you're doing bootlegging stuff, you're really pushing. You're like, look, it's not even my idea. It's just a thing that I think people will want it. I think people will make money. Or why else would you do it? Why else would you bootleg something? I mean, of all the things you could be doing with your life. So if you're bootlegging something, it's because you're like, okay, this is a good idea. This is gonna work. I'm gonna get this thing across. Um, it should it should hit all those marks. And to be able to hit all those marks really takes a lot more like back end effort. It really takes a lot more drive. It takes a lot more pushing and focus and really sort of championing that not only that form or that idea, but that idea that form not only that form or idea, but like that like what that whole the whole concept, the whole thing. Um, I feel that like if you're gonna bootleg something and you're altering it, you're changing it, you're putting your own kind of thumbprint on it, you're being mindful of the people if you're doing it of a current maker, giving them a heads up, um, figuring out if there's some licensing fee or some type of compensation. Um, I mean, I think if you can be kind of like the best representative within your community or kind of do the best you can, try to do the least harm. Um, Obviously, we'll see how this project goes. We'll see. Maybe I'll be reporting 6 months from now, which is a big old black guy. Be like, guys, still make bootlegs. Um, I don't know. I mean, people are going to get grumpy. People are going to get pissed. People are going to have opinions. But all of that stuff, I mean, that really is the controversial stuff that really gets everybody all Twitter pated and all up in arms and have a strong opinion. Um, in talking about this bootlegging stuff, I've gotten really great responses. I mean, I read two, but I got a lot of really great responses. I got a lot of really great opinions. So obviously, it has this kind of like deep, visceral, tug at people's opinion strings. I would like to, as I sort of flush out this idea, I know I've got a bunch of stuff going on. I really need to sit down and really lock all these different projects that I've been talking about coming up. They are a bit grander in scope, and I think that's why I've been kind of just sort of voicing them out a little bit because it has been really helpful for me to be able to get any of the reciprocity that I get from people seeing these videos, sending me messages, sending me opinions, um, insight, all that stuff. It has really helped me kind of get a better sense of all the different things that are going on and the parts that all the different working parts that need to get in there. Whereas it's a little bit harder when you're just kind of sitting at your desk with a piece of paper and you're like, ideally, I should be writing all this stuff out, but I find my writing tends to be a bit slower. So, what I've been doing, I'll then also go back and re-listen to this stuff, and I'll take little notes as well. Hopefully, I will find someone who can help me do video editing so I can start making these like actually really concise tutorials. Hopefully, eventually soon here, I'll get set up with a better setup for doing video. What else? I'm gonna work more on this bootleg project here, just to kind of push a few things through, just to give people a little bit of an idea. I'm still kicking around if I should make this thing or not. Um, I sent a picture to Izumo already. He was like, "Oh, nice" or something. I forget what he said. He's a super nice guy, so I think we'll probably be able to figure something else out. Mori, I haven't talked to him yet, but I'll talk to him about that. And then hopefully this is kind of like a regular series that I can do of bootlegging people that I either admire or don't admire. And I think I've got this idea of doing it so that it really is much more of the people. So I think what we'll do is like, for example, let's just say, this figure. As an example, I'm not committing anything, but I was thinking, so let's say I decide to sell the figure. You can, as a customer, you can pre-order like a few different tiers, or as a painter, you can order like the painter set, and then when you get your figures, paint it, package it, and then sell it, however, in whatever capacity you want. $2. But I think especially doing something like bootlegging, putting it really more in the hands of fans and collectors and painters and people in the community doing all that other stuff. Sharing the burden, just kind of deflecting, sort of, it's always nice to have somebody else's name on the shitty, grumpy bootleg so you can just be like, I don't know, man. That guy bought them. I'm not sure what they do with them. There's all kinds of weird, shit. I don't know. Um, I mean, I am goofing, but I I would like it to be more communal, I guess. Um, but yeah, again, that could just me. That could just be me wanting to not be as complicit. Um, Other than that, I have Wonderfest is coming up this Sunday. I'm knocking a bunch of stuff out. I just wanted to finish up this stuff just to get an idea, but then I'm going to be doing Wonderfest stuff all the way up to Wonderfest. Come check us out. If you're in Tokyo, go to Wonderfest. We're hall 4, kind of when you come down the escalators. We're like the second row or so. We're right on the corner. We got a pretty good spot. I'm going to be making a bunch of weirdo shit. We'll see if anybody wants it. I'm not sure. I kind of feel like with these conventions, I just sort of feel like you have your Tembaya, then you have your toy collector, and then you've got your kind of casual looky loo. And I feel like for that stuff, if you just do the weirdest thing you possibly can, you have a better chance of grabbing the most weirdo looky loos. I don't know. We'll see. But I got to start knocking a bunch of stuff out here. Um, which, hey, is great timing. I'm at my hour. I did an hour. I'll try to do these more. I'll try to do these more regularly. And, if I fuck up, I won't beat myself up. Just, I'm doing me one day at a time. But thank you. Thanks, everybody, for watching these. Thanks, everybody, for listening to my rambles and rants. I really appreciate everybody following me through in this herky jerky patchwork manner I've got set up. I am working towards a better arrangement here, so thank you for bearing with me. Thanks to all the help, support, questions. I really appreciate it. If there's anything I brought up that struck a chord, let me know. I'd love to read it out. I'd love